Good afternoon, everyone. It is Wednesday, November 2nd, 2022 at 3 o'clock p.m. And that means it's time for Women in Business. Now, our subject today is going to be voting. And I'm sure some of you are going, is this all she can talk about? But yeah, it kind of is right now because it's important. And the midterm elections happen next Tuesday. And so that's less than a week away. And it is important. And there's a lot of reasons why it's important. And we're going to talk about some of those today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why it's important that women vote. I'm going to talk about a variety of things. And some of it, especially the history part, I may have to read you a few things because honestly, there's a lot of dates and names and places and things. And it was a little more than I could commit to my brain. So I apologize for having to read to you a bit. Hopefully that won't be too off-putting. And while we're on the subject of voting, I just wanted to throw in a quick promo for sheshouldrun.org. It is a great resource if you are thinking of running for office, if you are looking for women to vote for who are running for office, if you want to offer support to women who are running for office, any of those things, sheshouldrun.org. It's a really, really good resource. I highly recommend it. I think we should all support it because it is definitely doing good work when it comes to getting more women in office, which incidentally is one of the reasons why you should vote, because getting more women in office is important. But that is not where we're going to start with this today. We're going to start with the start, because when you, what's that song? Let's start at the very beginning, a very fine place to start, from The Sound of Music. And yes, I'm a musical geek. Shoot me. What do you want? So anyway, the 19th Amendment is where we start. The 19th Amendment is the amendment that gives women the right to vote. It was ratified in August of 1920. It was first introduced to Congress as an amendment 42 years before that. 42 years. It took almost half a century to convince the men in power that women should be treated as equal citizens when it comes to voting. So if you want one reason, one big reason why voting as a woman is important, it's the fact that it took us 42 years to get the right. 42 years. I mean, can you imagine what that felt like for the women who were trying to make that happen? And I know from watching documentaries that they would almost get there and almost have the votes, and then somebody would sabotage the whole thing, or something would come up and distract from it, and then they wouldn't get it ratified, or they'd get it past the Congress and then the states would ratify it. It was a thing. It was a real thing, and it took a really long time to get the 19th Amendment ratified. They actually passed it in 1919, Congress did, and then they had to get a certain percentage of the states that were states at the time, to ratify it, and that took until August of 1920 before the last state ratified it, and that was a squeaker, basically. It was not something that necessarily was an assured thing. So we really could be sitting here today still disenfranchised without the right to vote. And that's a scary thought, because voting is one of the ways that you exercise your power, your intellectual power, your political power, the power of your beliefs, any of those things. But we're not there yet. Let's start with the 19th Amendment. So in general, the history of civil rights is said to start in June of 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. This was a convention founded by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a bunch of other women that basically said, hey, we are human beings. We are citizens of this country. We deserve to have a say. They actually rewrote the Declaration of Independence to say, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal, which I think is kind of fun. I think nowadays we probably go for all people are created equal, but same general idea. So what they did in 1848 is they basically held this big meeting. There were about 300 women there, and they talked about why women deserved rights and what rights women deserved. And voting was only one of the rights they covered. But basically, one of the things that they were trying to do was to fight against the perception at the time that women's proper place was in the home. She was supposed to be subservient and quiet and take her views and her positions from her husband. And women couldn't own property. Women didn't have custody of their kids. I mean, there was just, women were basically not people, really, in a sense. And it sounds very Dickensian and kind of, and don't even get me started on what it was like when they were fighting for the vote in England, because that's a whole nother thing. But I mean, the women here worked for 42 years to, I mean, even longer than 42 years, because Seneca Falls was in 1848. But they worked, and some got arrested and some got beaten, and women were very, very targeted and downtrodden somewhat if they were suffragettes, if they were trying to get the 19th Amendment passed. So you have to keep in mind that this is a right that people felt was worth risking, whether it was risking their livelihood or risking their family relationships or risking their lives for. And that's a big thing. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are probably the two names that anyone would know from the beginning of the civil rights movement, or excuse me, of the women's rights movement, the suffragette movement. And they were the two that were mostly the drivers of it for a very, very long time. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote a book that was quite influential. Susan B. Anthony traveled and traveled and traveled and traveled and lobbied Congress and senators and everybody to try to get them to pass this amendment and to try to get things in the right frame of mind to even make that possible. Now, in 1869, there was a group created called the National Women's Suffrage Association, which was founded by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and they began to fight for the amendment. So some people said at the time, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that it was a wrong thing to try to get the women's suffrage amendment passed, because at that time in 1869, they were passing the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men the right to vote. And some people felt that that was far enough and that was probably too much already. Let's not endanger that amendment by also trying to give women the right to vote. So that kind of gives you a sense of, given how historically African-American, Black people, whatever terminology you want to use, have been treated and had been treated under Jim Crow laws and all the things that were done to them. The fact that it was thought that women's suffrage was so beyond the pale that if it was passed, it would endanger giving Black men the vote. That should tell you what the attitude was at the time. It was not warm and fuzzy, yes, we want to embrace women and we think they should be equal. It was not at all. So there were various groups that started and worked for women's suffrage. There were Elva Vanderbilt Belmont was a pretty big suffragette and did a lot and led one of the organizations for a while. And basically what the suffragettes finally figured out was the way that maybe they could get this done was not to say women were citizens and deserved to be equal, but basically say women deserve to get the vote because they weren't men, because they could be politically virtuous, because their moral character would uplift the country, which is kind of crap when you think about it. But for the time period when there was a lot of temperance going on and a lot of women who were, fighting against drinking in saloons and who were fighting for the moral purity of the country, so to speak, this was a little more palatable political idea that yes, women need to vote because they'll uplift the moral character of the country. Now, some of the women who were running the movement were smart enough to realize that this was an idea that maybe would fly. And it was also an idea that was a little more palatable. It didn't force men to admit that women were equal and should be equal, but it allowed them to still kind of hold on to the idea of the woman as the nurturing mother and the nurturing wife and the person who's mostly connected to the house and whose job is to raise moral and upright children and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of sad that also one of the ideas that really sold the suffragette movement was that there were some people that were worried about Black men being given the vote, and they were told, hey, if you let white women have the vote, then there'll be more white people voting. Now, that isn't to say that there weren't women of color advocating for the vote, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But one of the ways that they sold, let's get this amendment passed, is hey, white men, if you're worried about Black men voting, and this was in the brief period of Reconstruction before they put in all the Jim Crow laws and the grandfather clauses and the poll taxes and the literacy tests and all the other things that pretty much ensured that even though the 15th Amendment said Black men could vote, most of them wouldn't, and wouldn't again until the 1964 Voting Act. But it's sad, but it is true that maybe part of the reason that we women originally got the right to vote is because white supremacists wanted more white people voting, which is sad. But so the right to vote was a gradual thing. The amendment was passed giving all women the right to vote in August of 1920. That's when it was ratified. But starting in 1910, some of the states, mostly in the West, began to give women limited rights to vote and allow them to vote in certain elections. But a lot of the southern and the eastern states resisted because they just didn't want women to vote. There was the theory that women weren't smart enough to vote. There was the theory that women should just vote as their husbands voted, so why did they need a separate vote? And starting about 1916, they started pushing a little more. They started doing hunger strikes. They started doing protests. There were a couple of women who camped outside the White House for quite a while with banners and signs, and they would get arrested like daily. And then other women would go and they'd show up the next day and they'd do the same thing. And they were hoping that the president would see these signs and decide that he would do something to help influence in favor of women's rights. And then I think what finally pushed it over the top is World War I, because men were gone. Women had to do some of the work, not as much as they did in World War II, but they did have to do some. And women working on behalf of the war effort, women being patriotic, women proving that they were citizens that were supporting their country, kind of made people look at things a little differently and say, maybe this is something we need to do. And then in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, and women were allowed to vote for the first time in November of that year. Now, here's the next thing we need to talk about. Equal rights for all women. I would really, 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 really love to say that the equal rights movement was completely not with any racial component, that women of all colors worked together to enfranchise everyone, and it's a lovely story, and I wish to God that I could say that. I can't. Unfortunately, what happened is the white women tended to disenfranchise the women of color because they were afraid that it was too much to ask to not only give women the vote, but give women of color the vote. They were afraid that it would turn senators and legislators off. They were scared that it would basically sabotage their effort. So they really didn't do it, which is really sad. So I want to read you some things because I think this is important stuff to know. We need to be aware of this. So basically what happened is persistent and prevalent racism throughout the era when the amendment was being debated infected the suffrage movement, resulting in the 19th Amendment, which basically secured the vote for middle-class white women, but didn't do much for women of color. Despite the fact that the amendment had passed, many women of color were still barred from the polls because of all the things, especially in the South, that had been set up to make sure that Black people in general couldn't vote. Voter suppression tactics, intimidation, denial because of ancestry, our immigrant status, all those things. So you have this problem where you got this shiny new amendment that says women can vote. They are now citizens, but there's a little asterisk on it that says, unless you're anything other than white. If you're anything other than white, good luck with that. And that's really, I think, something that's important to know, because we tend to gloss over that part, that it's like all these women valiantly working together and they got the vote and yay, isn't that great? And now we've had the vote ever since, which ever since means 102 years. And our country is, I don't even know how old now, but older than 102, let's put it that way. So, and like I said, it took almost half a century to convince legislators to even pass the amendment. That's just blows my mind. But also what we're missing is a lot of the stories of some of the women of color who helped. We all know Elizabeth Cady Stanton. We all know Susan B. Anthony. We may know Elva Vanderbilt Belmont. You may know other women, Lucretia Mott, other women who got involved in this kind of thing. And you may know those names. And they're all almost universally white women. You don't know the names of Ida B. Wells, Mabel Ping Hua Lee, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Jovita Idar, Suzette LaFleche Tibbles, who were women of color who also worked to make the 19th Amendment happen. And I will be looking up these women and spotlighting them on the Women in Business Facebook page if you want to learn more about these women, and probably in the Women in Garment Decoration Facebook group as well, because I think that's important. And that also, when we talk about the suffrage movement, we also kind of go, okay, 1848, Seneca Falls, that's when it started. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton had this idea, and that was the genesis of the whole thing. Not really true at all. There were Native American tribes. I cannot pronounce this to save my life, but I'm going to try. The Haudenosaunee women, who were a Native American tribe who had held political and other societal rights in their sovereign nations. And also in part of the kind of inspiration for the women's suffrage movement was the abolitionist movement, the effort to try to free the slaves. And Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, who were famous abolitionists, were also working for the rights of women. So there were a lot of people who were not white, who were a vital part of this movement, but we aren't really told about that. And that's really kind of a sad sort of thing. So basically, what happened was in August of 1920, the 19th Amendment gets adopted, and everybody goes, yay, women have the right to vote. And like I said, what happened was that there was kind of a little asterisk by the 19th Amendment that said white women have the ability to vote. And even a smaller asterisk that said white women who have money have the right to vote. So basically, if you were a poor white woman, your odds of voting were probably less. If you were a woman of color, your odds were considerably less. And that's really, really sad, especially since those women had worked to make this amendment happen. And here's the reason why a lot of these women didn't get to vote. I want to list a couple of acts here. Chinese Americans were not able to vote until the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943. And for most other Americans of Asian ancestry, their right to vote came in 1952. And Native Americans were not able to vote in all states until 1948. Black people, particularly those living in the South with Jim Crow laws, were barred from voting through the use of poll taxes, literacy tests, white-only primaries, and other barriers and acts of violence that were designed to keep them from voting. It wasn't until 1964 and the Voting Rights Act that people of color were able to vote reliably. So when we celebrate that passage of an act in 1920, we need to add some asterisks to it. And we need to say, yes, this was a victory, and yes, this gave us our rights, but there were some people who were left out of that, and we need to be aware of that, and we need to be working to change that because some of this stuff still exists today. So we need to do things like get rid of voter ID laws and deal with inaccessible polling places and voter roll purges and voter intimidation efforts and limited access to early voting and disinformation campaigns. All of those things are keeping people from voting. All of those things are keeping people from exercising a right that women fought for 42 years. And that's not right. And we shouldn't do that. So we need to have voting reform. And I know people don't like to talk about this and it's a controversial issue. So what? The right to vote is supposed to be a fundamental human right available to every American citizen, regardless of gender, regardless of age, regardless of race. It's supposed to be available to all of us. If we want to live up to what we say our country is, then we have to make sure that everybody has the chance to exercise their voice. And that means we may have to change some things. And that means we may have to make absentee ballots available to everybody, which my state, Michigan, has done. I voted absentee on both ballots this year, and I love it. It's great. I can take the time to research the issues. I can look at the ballot as much as I want. I can do it whenever I have time, and I don't have to worry about going somewhere on a particular day. It's wonderful. And there are other things like that. We need to look at gerrymandering, which is partisan. We need to look at, let's see, what else is here? Voter registration members, like automatic registration, same-day registration, online registration, longer voting periods, all that stuff. And why this is important is because the right to vote is fundamental to living in a democracy. And the more that you abridge the right to vote, the less buy-in you have among voters. If you feel like nobody cares what you think, if you feel like it's going to be made as hard as possible for you to cast your vote, Eventually, you may just decide, screw it, it isn't worth it. And that's not what we're supposed to be about. The women who fought for 42 years did not fight all that time so that 102 years later, there were women going, nope, this is too hard. I don't want to do this. So if I'm passionate about this, it's because this is important. And I will put my hand up as someone who, when I was younger, I didn't vote because it wasn't convenient and it was annoying and I didn't understand why it was important. And nobody had ever really sat me down and told me the history. And nobody had ever really impressed on me that, hey, women in this country have only had the vote for, when I was 19, it was less than 100 years. Or when I was 18, it was less than 100 years. I don't want to do the math to figure out how long ago that was. It was probably like 60 years or 70 years. 70 years probably. So, it hadn't been that long. 70 years sounds like a long time until you put it up against the entire history of your country. And then it's like, oh, that's not that long. I should maybe think about that. I should maybe think about why it's important that I use this right that people fought for me to have. And then I make it easy for other people to have this right. And here's the thing. I've said before and often that I don't care who you vote for, which is a little disingenuous because of course I care who you vote for. I have my beliefs and my political opinions, and I think there are right people to vote for and wrong people to vote for. I'm a human being. I have my own opinions. But in the aggregate, I really don't care who you vote for. I care that you vote. I would rather that you voted for something that I don't agree with than you didn't vote at all. And maybe that's weird, but I have to believe that if enough of us get motivated and enough of us care, and I also have to practice what Eric Campbell would call the principle of charity, which is you assume that everyone has the best motivation possible for whatever they're doing. And that's basically what I try to do. So I assume that if somebody is voting for something that I think is perhaps not the wisest thing to vote for, or, maybe a little scary or wrong-headed, that they're voting because by their lights, they're doing the right thing. They're doing something that they think is right. That's what I choose to believe. Now, sometimes I'm probably wrong. I'm sure there are people out there who are voting for things because they want to stop other people from having things, doing things, whatever it is. I'm not naive. I understand how the world works and I understand how people are motivated. But I still think, especially if you're a woman, voting is important, because one of the things that we found out this year that we didn't really understand, I don't think, prior to this, is that rights that we thought were rights that were assured forever can be taken away. And yes, I'm talking about Roe, but I don't think we really had comprehended it up to that point, because that was the first kind of big landmark piece of legislation that was overturned that really impacted a significant portion of the population. And I could be wrong about that. I'm sure there are people of color who could name other things. But for me, that was the thing that I was like, oh, okay, this means that we maybe are not as secure in our rights and our freedoms as I thought we were. And maybe I need to make sure that the people that are in power are people who agree with the things that I agree with, in as much as that's possible. So that's an incentive for voting too. So let's talk about that a little bit. What are some incentives for voting? First one is really what I was just talking about. Make your voice heard. If you care about something, and it could be something on the local level, it could be something on the national level, it could be something on the state level, it could be a particular issue. Maybe you care about clean beaches, maybe you care about good schools, maybe you care about healthcare, maybe you care about taking care of old people, maybe you care about how your cities, zones, its shopping districts, whatever it is. Make your voice heard. And that means vote. That means perhaps volunteer to support candidates or issues that you care about. It means talking about these things. It might mean canvassing. It might mean making phone calls. This year, it seems to mean sending texts up the wazoo. I've gotten so many texts from various candidates. How that's legal, I don't know, but apparently it is. Make your voice heard if you care about something. And if you don't care about something, for God's sakes, find something to care about, whatever it is. And here's the thing. A lot of people think that it doesn't matter, and we'll talk about that a little later. But if you care about something, and if something means something to you, and if it matters to you, and if you're concerned about it, then put your vote out there. Get your voice heard. And you don't have to be protesting and carrying signs, and you don't have to be burning things down or doing a sit-in or whatever it is. A lot of the 1960s tactics are starting to come back a little bit, and I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. I'm not always sure that's the best way to do things. But talk. And keep in mind that you don't have to have a national platform. Talk to your kids, talk to your parents, talk to your relatives, talk to your friends, talk to people in your PTA circle, talk to people in your sewing circle or your quilting circle or whatever it is that you do, your hiking club. Talk to them about the issues. Find out what people are thinking. Let people know what you're thinking. These are important things. And I think it's kind of become over the years a little bit like you aren't supposed to talk about what you care about, and you aren't supposed to talk about what you want to vote for, and you aren't supposed to talk about the issues that matter to you. Or if you do, you're supposed to take it so over the top that it becomes it isn't a discussion anymore. It's just a diatribe of, this is what I think, and I'm going to blast you with it like it's a fire hose, because I want to convince you to do what I want you to do. Not helpful, not useful, not in any way productive, I guess is the word that I want to say. Because here's the thing. We've lost the ability to have civil discourse in this country. And civil discourse means I talk to you and you talk to me, and perhaps we don't agree on whatever topic we're discussing, but we can give each other the benefit of the doubt, and we can have a civil discussion without name calling, without chanting "lock her up," without calling people thugs or thieves or whatever it is. We can actually have a civil conversation. And I think we need to figure out how to do that again. And I don't know if that's start teaching debate in high school again. If they stop teaching it, I have no idea if they did or not, or what that is. But we need to learn how to do that, because we've lost the ability to have rational, reasonable discussions. And to have a discussion that ends and we walk away and neither of us have had our minds changed, but we can both go, okay, they believe what they believe and I believe what I believe, and we're both good people and we're both trying to do what we think is right based on our beliefs and morals and abilities and knowledge and education and whatever it is. And I really, really think we need to practice that more often. It's a hard thing to do. I get it, because I hear people talk and I go, seriously? You believe that? You want that? You think that's the right thing to do? So I'm as human as anybody else. There are things that I think are right and there are things that I think are wrong. But I am willing to listen to you while you tell me what it is that you think we should do. And I'm willing to listen to you with, I won't say an open mind necessarily, because I think but I'm willing to listen to you with an open heart, maybe, with the idea that by your lights, you're trying to do what you think is right. And I want to understand why you think that's right, if that makes sense. And I think that's part of making your voice heard too, is here's what I think. Here's why I think this is right. Here's why I think this is important. I want to tell you about this. And I fully realize that as I'm saying this, I don't really talk about my political beliefs all that much. I'm pretty sure anybody who's spent any time listening to me talk probably knows I'm pretty liberal. Not a shocker, I would guess. But I don't talk a lot about what I believe, mostly because I feel like my role in all this, for some weird reason, is to be the person who facilitates the conversation for others. So I try to keep my personal beliefs out of it for the most part. If anybody wants to know what mine are, if anybody wants to talk about that, I'm up for it. I'll do it. But that's not habitually been my role. But I do things like this, where I am still making my voice heard, maybe not about a specific issue, but I'm encouraging other people, because if enough of us make our voices heard, we can make change, and change is a good thing. Now, another reason to vote, women's issues. You knew this one was coming. So like I said earlier this year, we discovered that some of the rights that we thought were fairly fundamental and protected are maybe not as fundamental and protected as we had assumed. And so this brings the question, if one right can be taken away, can other rights be taken away? And what actually guarantees a right? There is and I was really a little bit sad to find this out, but there is a procedure in place for repealing amendments to the Constitution. It has never been done. It's not an easy procedure, but it is possible. And I think, and no, I'm not saying I think the 19th Amendment is, I'm not saying I think any amendment's going to be repealed. I don't think that's in anybody's mind, but I'm just saying it can be a slippery slope. And I also think that the people who are most qualified to deal with women's issues and to decide on women's issues are women. And if we don't speak up, and women's issues can be, yes, abortion is reproductive freedom, I guess I would say, is a woman's issue. Childcare is a woman's issue. Maternal health is a woman's issue. Equal pay is a woman's issue. I mean, yes, there are men involved in all these things too, and they certainly have a part of the franchise, so to speak, but a lot of these things are things that really impact women. And I think women need to speak up and exercise their right to make their views known. And yeah, you can have views that say, I don't care about reproductive freedom, or I'm not worried about equal pay, or I think women should all stay home and that would take care of the maternal health problem or the child care problem. It's a valid viewpoint. It's not necessarily a viewpoint I would subscribe to, but it's a valid viewpoint. So you really need to keep in mind that women's issues are people issues. So we need to also have allies among the male population to get these things passed. But that's also where using your voice and speaking up on these issues is how you get allies and how you convince people. And that's important too. And I don't know. I mean, okay, here's what I'm going to say. And I don't want to sound alarmist, but at the same time, I kind of do want to sound alarmist, because I think this is something that we need to look at. And that is the fact that rights that can be given can be taken away. And if you don't make sure that the people in power are people who are going to support and protect your rights, then you are opening the door to not having those rights any longer. And I would like you to keep in mind that it took 50 years to get the 19th Amendment passed, and that we as women have only had the right to vote for 102. and that women of color have mostly had the right to vote unimpeded for less time than that. So, as much as I want to believe that we live in a utopian world where the people in power are going to look out for everybody and make sure no one is disenfranchised and everybody has what they need, I don't think that's accurate all the time. I don't think that's accurate a lot of the time. And I think one of the ways to make it more accurate is to make sure that people who represent you, literally, people who are like you, and like you in they're the same sex, they're the same gender, they have the same issues, they experience the same struggles, are in the legislative bodies. And that means they're in your city government, they're in your state government, and they're in the national government. That's important. And that's why you need to vote. And I'm not saying you need to vote for women because they're women. I think that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. You vote for women because they're women and they support the ideas that you support, and they support the platforms that you support, and they support the issues that you support. That's why you vote for women. Now, another thing I want to talk about really quickly is political cynicism. And I will put my hand up, and wow, this sun is just really going nuts here. I will put my hand up that I am probably as cynical about politics as anybody out there. I want to believe in the Mr. Smith Goes to Washington kind of politics. That's a Jimmy Stewart movie from like the 40s or 50s, I think. But I don't really think that's true. I think a lot of politicians are not necessarily working for the people who elected them. And I think that's part of the reason why we also need to vote, because we need to vote new people in. We need to get rid of these people who have made a career out of being politicians, because that's not helpful. And if you're making your bank on selling influence or being on a legislative committee, then you're going to work hard to make sure that you keep that money flow coming in. And yeah, you could get started on how the political process needs reformation. I would not argue with you. You can get started on lobbying and how that's an evil, and I would not probably argue with you there. But the way to affect change is to vote, is to make your voice heard, is to stand with other people who believe what you believe and collectively say, we think this is wrong, we think this should change, we want to get rid of this. That's why I was talking about She Should Run earlier. She Should Run is an organization that facilitates women running. It'll help them learn how to run. It'll help you find women who are trying to get elected, all these things. And it's important. So you need to make sure that you don't let your political cynicism get in the way of voting. And yeah, it's a lot easier, honestly, to just say, it doesn't matter. My vote doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who I vote for because the system is rigged and it's jury locked and it's deadlocked and there's log jams and nothing ever gets done and blah, 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 blah. And you're not necessarily wrong, but the only way we change that is by voting and getting new people in office and getting in people who want to affect change and getting in people who, and I know this is like anathema right now, but getting in people who are willing to work together, regardless of political ideology, to try to find a compromise that actually gets things done. And I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying it's something that we need to do. And this sun is just driving me nuts, but we're almost done here. So the last thing that I want to talk about is creating change. And creating change is basically why you should vote. If you don't like something, if you think something is wrong, if you think something is scary, if you think something is, if you're cynical and you think that the people who are there now are not representing you, get new people. Seriously, all of this stuff. Change is important. we have to change with the times, and the times don't stay the same. And I think right now we're operating a little bit in an old mode of politics, and we need to look at that mode and go, okay, this doesn't work anymore. We need to make it better, and we need to make it different. And that's where creating change comes in. And sometimes change takes a long time. Like I said, 42 years to get the 19th Amendment passed. From the first time that it was proposed in Congress, it took 42 years to get it passed. That's a heck of a long time. So what do we start doing today that it maybe takes 30 years to do, or 20 years to do, or 10 years to do? But if we don't start working on that stuff now, we're never going to get it done. The women who started with the suffragist movement, the women who started with started what would eventually become the 19th Amendment, they didn't know it would ever get passed. They were hopeful. They got very politically savvy. They studied the politicians. They learned how the system worked, but they didn't know they could make change. The civil rights people in the 1960s who were getting beaten and blasted with hoses and bitten by dogs and jailed and intimidated like crazy, they didn't know that anything would ever happen. They didn't know that a Voting Rights Act would be passed. They didn't know the change that they would affect. They hoped, they trusted in the process, but they didn't know. And that's important. And I think I feel like I could go on and just be passionate about this for like hours and hours, but honestly, my voice is starting to go and this sun is driving me nuts. So I'm just going to say, here's the main message that I want to get across to everybody. Election day is next Tuesday. Vote. Make your voice heard. Do what you think is right. And do it with pride and do it with intention, because that's what's important. And thank you all for listening to me today. I'm sorry that we're a little short, but I know from recording my video for the virtual Applique Getaway, which, by the way, quick plug for that, just because, go to appliquegetaway.com if you have not registered, and register for the virtual getaway. Lots of instructors, great goodie bag, amazing prizes, great live demos. You should really, really go and become a part of virtual Applique Getaway. Thank you, everybody. I hope I didn't rant too much, and I will see you all next week. Bye.